Hello and welcome to Gabbitt Media, I'm Gabbitt, and today I'm going to show you how I made this builder's hut. This is for the game Atlas Empires, which I'm currently working on. Do check out the links in the description. I've got several playlists, one for Atlas Empires, one for texture painting, details about graphics tablets that I use, and there's a link to Atlas Empires, the game, there as well. So this is all sped up 10 times, so it's 1000%, and you can see the basic modelling and the texture painting as well a bit later on. So you can see me starting off the project here. It's fairly straightforward, there's nothing very detailed in the shape, so you're just getting the very basic shapes. So I'm always trying to think about the silhouette and matching up the shape to meet that. So looking at it from different angles and making sure that the outline is there. You're not trying to put any real detail inside the shape, so where the silhouette edges are, that's where your detail is. So you can see that I'm putting in tiny notches and things like that, or jutting out a piece of wood, but that's because that will be noticed in the silhouette. But anything on the inside of that big plank, you're not going to notice, and you're going to paint that in. So try and think about the silhouette when you're modelling. Same thing for the tree trunk here, again just finding some notches as if roots are sticking out, those sort of things. So I'm doing the planks now, and I'm doing it very basic. Again, I'm trying to limit the amount of vertices as well, that's quite important. So rather than doing 3 separate planks, I've done one plank with notches in and acting like it's sort of joined together with tiny notches, so you can see separate planks, but in reality they're just one big blob of a shape. You can also see that I go in and adjust the vertices count as well, so I join up some of the vertices. I just have vertex snapping on and make sure that it merges when they're joined, and that's an option within your tools. I don't really have any set way of modelling, I often just adapt my shape afterwards, so using things like filling in faces and loop cuts and things like that, it's all really straightforward and really sort of kind of obvious when you get used to it, but it does take a bit of getting used to, and it's quite tough for beginners to see the shapes in 3D sometimes. But generally speaking, I'm keeping everything really simple and really basic. Where possible, if there's an object that's a separate object in real life, I just model that as a separate object. If it's joined up, I tend to often model it as part of the shape. And that's a general rule to go by. It doesn't really matter too much. As long as it looks good at the end, it doesn't really make much difference, especially with these objects as they're not being animated. Even when it's animated, you only really have to think about the joints and where things are going to bend, and that's where it's crucial to make sure that it's all one object so it can stretch rather than pull apart. A few people have asked me about n-gons and whether that's okay. Yep, n-gons are fine, they're there. We have the ability to create them for a reason. They're quite useful. They're just not great in terms of adding a loop cut. As soon as you add an n-gon somewhere, you can't put a loop cut in. Or if you have any triangles, again, you can't add loop cuts in so easily. So it's something that you really don't want to do straight away if you want to add loop cuts to your object. But if you're at a certain stage where you're just trying to roughly get the shape, then it's absolutely fine. And n-gons, of course, you don't really want to use them round a corner, for example, because it just won't show that corner and it will be all over the place. So on a corner you want to have vertices, obviously. But generally if it's on a flat surface, an n-gon's fine. It's not going to make any difference, because when you take it across to a game engine, or even when it's rendered, it will be converted to triangles anyway. So don't worry too much about them, don't panic. It's more about your ability to create the shapes, and does it look like the actual shape and the outline, the silhouette, and then you do all the details with the painting. I tend to switch between a sort of box modelling approach, where you obviously start with something like a box, and then modelling with planes, so sort of flat surfaces. You start with a plane and you sort of build it up slowly. And it depends on the shape. Things like walls are obviously going to be a plane, and then I just slot them in to something that's been box modelled, like a pillar in this case, or a wooden beam, and then the plane sort of sits in there, and that works out fine. Yes, there's a lot of overlapping edges. It's not actually that big an issue. If you wanted to go absolutely super optimized, then yes, I think it does make a tiny weeny bit of difference. But generally these days, with processing power of computers, phones and so forth, it's not that big an issue. That's what I've found from my research anyway, and what I've been told. So you can see I'm making this funny looking beam here, and I'm doing quite a weird job of it really, and I never really know quite how I'm going to finish an object until I start it, and that's quite important in a way, to just start the project, get going, and if it's going wrong, just delete a few faces, add a few in, and don't worry too much about it. But often trying to visualize it before you start can really slow you down, and just going for it, failing and then reproducing it, deleting things, adding things, you slowly get there. And with more experience, you'll gather the best techniques to do things. You can see that I'm appending files from other files that I've already done, so trying not to repeat too many things, and I can't use the same texture space that often, but sometimes I can, so I repeat the textures as well and bake them onto my new texture. And you can see it's slowly starting to get there, always looking across at the concept art there, which you can see down in the bottom corner, trying to match it up and make sure it's fairly similar. For the most part, the concept art that I've been sent, I'm trying to keep very much to it as I possibly can. There may be things that I might change, so if something's really cylindrical or really circular, I'll possibly adapt that slightly and make it more chunky, just because it's better on polygon count and therefore render times. Occasionally I sometimes see things as I'm trying to reduce the amount of polys in it and then adapt it accordingly. And Chris, the concept artist, is fine for me to do that, and I think we have a good understanding of what looks good and what doesn't, so he's happy for me to do those sort of things. You can see on this saw here, that's fairly high poly really, and I could have probably reduced that slightly. I might go back to it a bit later on, I can't remember. But I can always snap some of those polygons together and sort them out. Again, it doesn't make a massive amount of difference if you've got, let's say, 50 more polygons in a model than you need. It's not really major these days with processing power. More important is the texture space. So where possible, I'm trying to repeat textures, and we're using a modular approach. I'm only using a 512 by 512 texture on this model, so it does get a little bit pixelated at times, and trying to find the best techniques to make the most of that texture space is more important. Because texture spacing and texture calls and all those sort of things are quite processor intensive still, so there's still an issue there that we need to address as artists. So going through the unwrapping phase, fairly basic again, just going through wherever there's a sort of obvious edge and corner, I'll just unwrap it there. I don't want too bigger areas either, because it won't unwrap easily, and I need to sort of marry all the places up in the UV map. And when you're texture painting, you don't have to worry too much. If I were bringing in textures and trying to map them, then I'd have to be a bit more precise, because you'd see the seams. But with texture painting, you don't see the seams, so you can be a bit rougher. So generally speaking, I'm just trying to create nice areas and boxes and spaces, so there's not too many islands, so I don't have to worry too much about that, but they're nice and even islands, so they're not huge great things or awkward shapes. So where possible, I'm trying to turn them into rectangular shapes in my UV map. I use the UV editing workspace for this, so I'm just on one side unwrapping, and I'm doing a live unwrap in most cases, I think, doing a live unwrap, and then just marking the seams, and it will update automatically when you do that. After the unwrap, there's a fair bit of sorting out to do, where I need to think about which shapes are being repeated, so I don't really want to. So if I've got an instance of an object, I don't need to have that in the way and be unwrapping that as well. So I just sort of organize it into groups, using the outliner, which is really nice in 2.8, and there's updates for it in 2.81 as well, which is really great, and I'm really pleased about that, because it really does help if you're organizing your work properly. And there you can see my UV map, and I just have a good look at that, good check around the place, and make sure there's no overlapping UVs or anything that looks a bit distorted in some way. I'm always a bit wary, so I do look quite closely, and any distortion and weird things, you can see me tidying up a few here, just looking around, make sure anything doesn't look odd and out of place. Again, that's something you get with experience. You'll know when a UV hasn't unwrapped properly, and you've probably just missed a seam somewhere, so you have to just identify that. This time I actually used a texture coordinate grid just to check that it was all unwrapping perfectly well and the sizes married up, but I don't usually do that because it does a good job anyway, so I haven't had any real problems with that, but I thought I'd just check this time. I'm not sure quite why I was getting paranoid there. So here you can see me checking for any sort of double-sided textures and just rotating the texture, I should say. So checking the normals and the face orientation before going into paint mode. So this is all set up in the usual way. I bring my palettes in, so I append the palette from the other files, so the textures will link up. It's kind of important to do that, so the models in the game don't look all really different in terms of colours, and it keeps a general colour palette and theme throughout the game. You can also see that the link files are painting on the same texture space, so I'm only painting one. It does of course save a lot of time and texture space, but if I had my way and I could just use as much texture space as I liked, then I would do them all as separate objects, and then they can react differently to the objects around them, which is quite nice in terms of shadow and highlights. And I feel that's what my models are really missing at the moment, is just that sort of texture and depth, because they're being repeated. I can't add too much character to them, otherwise you'll see the repetition across the different modules, and also I can't add too much shading to them, otherwise again you see that repetition. What you can do is do a couple of different types of log, maybe one that lies flat and one that lies upright or whatever it might be, but you are going to take up more texture space and it's very limited for these sort of models, so I've had to just do one and get it as close as I can and looking the best it can look. I always do the models the same way. I fill it in with a colour that's sort of a block colour, that's roughly the colour that it's going to end up as, then start adding a bit of variation just with the brush, and a very light brush, just dab on a bit of variation in terms of colours, and I use lots of different colours there as well, so all the colours from the colour palette I'll just randomly pick some and block it in, and that's when I add the detail after that, and then I tend to go to the screen and multiply brushes and use both those for highlights and crevices. However, I'm starting to use just the sample brush now, so I say sample brush, but just pressing S to sample a colour, and I didn't realise in the past that you can actually just press S and sample the colour without adding it to your colour palette. I thought you had to every time add it to your colour palette, which was a bit of a pain to be honest, but no, you don't have to do that at all. You can just press S and highlight the colour, and I prefer working in that way. But I still do use the multiply and screen brushes as well on occasions, because you can actually scrub over your detail, but with the multiply and screen brush, if you're using those, you're not, because it's taking the colour already there and adding to it. You can see as well I go from the principled BSDF to the viewer node. We're using the node wrangler. The viewer node will sort of give me a very flat look and how it will actually end up looking as well, whereas the principled BSDF takes into account shading. But I need that to see where the corners are so I can paint in those highlights. You can see when it's a big block of wood like this, and if they were individual planks in fact I wouldn't be able to add character, but because they're a big block I can add a bit of character to them, so you can see a few swirls around the place just to look like knots and grain and things. You can also see me highlighting the top a bit more and then using the multiply brush and darkening the bottom, so things at the top always pick up a little bit more light than the things at the bottom, and it just gives it that bit more depth, and it's worked nicely in this particular model. It's nice that there wasn't too many modular things, so I could get away with doing that in this particular model. This is a good example here of the whole process. So you can see I've blocked it in with a main colour. I'm just going through random colours now for the grains of wood, and then just adding in a bit of shading, just checking that the edges are all detailed as well, and just generally getting in that sort of look and feel of wood, and then I go in with the multiply brush and create those planks and just line them all up. Wobbly planks, so they're a bit distorted, just make sure they go down the side as well, and then add in some highlights afterwards. So there's the whole sort of painting process in the sort of highlighted in this small area here. Again, this was quite nice because again it's not modular, they aren't separate planks, so it's one big block, so I can add a bit of character, add a bit of interest this time. As you can see I'm doing sort of the swirls and things here as well. I often get asked things like, am I using a graphics tablet? Definitely. I could not possibly do this with just a mouse. It would be, it would be really impossible. I'm using a Wacom Mobile Studio Pro, I like that because it's a computer in itself. It's not just a display tablet, so I can take it away. It's a mobile studio, as it tries to be called. And so I'm drawing on the screen, and that's really helpful. I know people often use just normal tablets that aren't screen-based, but I do find it speeds up my workflow a considerable amount. So if you are thinking about getting into this more and you're looking to become a pro in this, then I would definitely recommend getting a display tablet. I looked at the XP Pen display tablet recently, which was very good. They're not as good as the Cintique yet, but they're getting much closer. There's a few glitches and minor things that are frustrating. So if you're a real pro, then you're obviously going to be going for the Cintique. But if you're looking to get into it, maybe an intermediate, maybe even advanced user and only do a bit of texture painting, then I would recommend things like the XP Pen. It was really good. And at about 1/10 of the cost of the Wacom Cintiques and Mobile Studio Pro. I have got lots of this information in other videos, and obviously I did a video on the XP Pen. It's the XP Pen Artist Pro 12, I think it was. So you can look that up on my channel and find out what I have to say about that one. I've also got a tablet guide as well, the ultimate tablet guide and display tablet guide, video that you can look at as well, and that should guide you through all the nuances of buying a tablet. I would say if you're going to be a texture artist, you will need to know how to paint wood, rocks and metal. They seem to be the main things that I paint. I always struggle a bit with metal, especially when it's modular, because metal depends a lot on the reflections, and if you move an object around it's got different reflections, so that's always a tough one. And you can see when I come up to the saw a bit later, I just tend to paint it a very sort of dark grey blue colour. It seems to work. You get sharper highlights with metals and softer highlights with things like wood, and somewhere in between with rock. In terms of how the project's going, it's going very well for me especially. I really like working with the team. The guy I'm working with, the concept artist, is really great, and it's nice to have that sort of encouragement from someone above you, as it were. A lot of freelance work I do, I'm not really working in a team, so you've just got the client, and that's a very different approach really. I like this approach because I can ask more questions about the process and things. So if you've got any particular questions that you want me to ask the developers of the game, then I'll do my best to try and find out for you. I don't know much about that side though, I'm obviously much more the art side, as you can tell. I think the game is hopefully going to be released at some time early next year, so I'm quite excited about that. I got to see my models in the game fairly recently, and it really makes a big difference to actually see that. It's very exciting. Now occasionally you can see there I decided to add a bit of a bevel to my shape, and occasionally I just think this really needs it, or this model doesn't, and maybe I was going a bit far at this time, but I felt like it needed a bit of a bevel, and you have to weigh up whether you need to, for artistic reasons, add that bevel, because it will add obviously quite a lot of polygons. A bevel is taking every edge and splitting it up into several, so you do have to watch out a little bit for that sort of thing. So you can see my rocky hammer. The highlights are a bit more extreme on the hammer, because it's rocky, so they're softer on wood. When I say softer, they're just sort of bigger highlights with not as much brightness in them, whereas the highlights on the rock, in this case, the rocky sort of stone, they're much brighter and sharper, so they're thinner. And the classic way of painting is to add sort of notches and scratches to things like stone and metal, and grain and knots and kinks to wood. I kind of prefer doing a single model like this. It's fairly rare. I'm doing mainly sets of 10 models, and they're all going onto one texture map, so it's quite hard to fit them in. And it's much more fun when I've got a bit more space to work with the texture map, and I'm not having to repeat the textures, because I can really go to town and create some exciting, fun stuff. But you can see the pixelation there on this texture. I mean, this is very close in, so we wouldn't really be this close in the game, so it's not anything to worry about. But it does show the limitations of working in this way as such, with such a small texture. That's another handy thing to know about painting, is leather. It's often used. I suppose I'm thinking very much of the fantasy genre, and that's my main genre that I like working in. I'm not so much a sci-fi, well, I am a sci-fi fan, but in terms of what I like to paint, I like to live in the fantasy realm. I occasionally have sort of music on that's from games like Witcher or whatever, just to get me in that sort of frame of mind. It's nice to have that sort of frame of mind going whilst you're doing these things. Whilst painting the saw, I thought about doing some sort of stripy glare on the saw blade. It sort of worked, but I wasn't quite sure. I thought I'd just keep it safe in the end and go for the familiar, just block colour. Sometimes if you add too much detail, it detracts a bit from the whole model, especially as this is going to be one model in quite a big area. So it'll be very small on screen really, and it is on a mobile screen as well, so I'm probably going overboard with a lot of this painting work, but it's nice to really go for it, and I'm enjoying it, and the team seem happy with the results, so that's great. Do remember to check out the playlist for texture painting. There's lots of details on there about how to paint wood, how to paint tree trunks, and I did a recent one on how to paint rope. So I'm trying to sort of break it down as well and give detailed tutorials, as well as these time lapses where I go a bit more of an overview and give sort of general hints and tips. You can see how these bottom support beams I'm doing a bit darker, and in fact the trunk I do darker as well. I would say that because it's got bark on, it's going to be a bit darker unless it's silver birch or something, but generally the tree trunk bark is going to be darker than the more planed wood, which tends to be the inside of the tree, which is lighter. So just watch out for those sort of things. Do look at reference images and make sure you follow along with real life, generally speaking. The bark here just follows that similar pattern again, where I'm highlighting the bits that stick out and pushing in the crevices with darker tones, and eventually it just sort of slowly comes together, slowly comes out. And here you can see I'm actually drawing on some shade of those support beams. Because it's not modular, I can add in those shadows so it works, but you have to be careful about doing that when you're doing modular things. Do ask any questions in the comments below. I do read all the comments, as you can probably tell. If you're a subscriber, then you probably realise that I do try and comment or respond to every comment that I get. Certainly read them, and I'm interested in the questions that you have, because sometimes it's a question that I haven't thought of and that makes me think about my approach. And it's nice actually to get some feedback, so if people have ideas about directions I should go. Lots of people talk about other programs and things and whether I've tried them, like Substance Painter for example, and I kind of trying to keep it to Blender, because that's what my channel's about as well, and then I can talk about the things that I'm doing freelance wise at the same time as teaching people about Blender. So I am trying to keep within Blender, but any questions like that, any advice, greatly appreciated. And like I say, I read them all, and yeah, it helps me out a lot. You can see me here just readjusting the models slightly, and it's not all about painting this section. You don't have to go modelling then painting. You can occasionally go back and to and fro, but generally speaking, once you've set your model, it's kind of there once you've started painting. Especially the unwrap, you can't really modify your shapes too much, otherwise it will affect the UV unwrap and then you'll be repainting. So there is a sort of destructive quality to this process. But tiny bits of movement and just tidying things up, that all works out fine. So you can see this is sort of brushed metal, this top stand here, and it's got very sort of sharp highlights and quite high contrast between the base colour and the highlights, and that's the shininess supposedly. I quite like painting these big areas, these sort of planks of wood coming across the top of the roof, a sort of strange sort of roof tile approach. It's good fun, I enjoyed this. I don't know why, maybe it's just big spaces are less fiddly, and I've got to try and create the illusion of depth in them as well, so that's quite fun. It's the usual case of adding notches and little bits and pieces around the place with just highlights and crevices. I suppose really when you're texture painting, it's more about understanding light and how light reacts to your objects than it is about colour or anything like that. Some people are asking how long is this whole project going to go on for. I think I'm kind of, there's enough work for me until about Christmas time-ish, and then I think they've obviously got to, well, hopefully they'll be doing the final touches to the game at that point to release, like I say, early next year. So there'll be a few more videos like this. I have got a bit of a backlog ready for YouTube as well, so I've recorded lots of this sort of process, ready to do a commentary over the top to kind of inform people. It is nice to be able to combine my freelance work with my YouTube channel, so I can sort of have two birds with one stone type attitude to things, and it's nice to keep in touch with the community out there and have an actual sort of real life project to be talking about at the same time. And one thing I would like to get more into is the blogging. I don't get a lot of time because I'm doing all this Atlas Empires stuff and other freelance work and my teaching. It's tough to sort of fit it all in, and to try and sort of really think about which YouTube video to do next as well. It gets quite busy. It's all good fun and it's very enjoyable. But if you have any ideas about YouTube videos or anything you'd like to see from this particular series, then do let me know and I'll try my best to fit it in. Now this is a rare occasion where I'm using layering. Layering is quite awkward within Blender, so you have to set up a mix node and a new texture, and then when I come to complete the texture I have to bake it all out. Not that that's, I'm being a bit unfair on Blender there, it's just a process, but that's why I rarely use it, because it takes a bit more time to set up, and the process of baking afterwards is sometimes a little bit glitchy, so you have to watch out for it. So yeah, there's a bit of work to be done when you're doing layers, so I tend to steer clear of it. But you can see it makes sense to do the sort of paint over and things like these tiny details as a separate layer, and then I don't mess up the whole textures underneath. I would like a better layering system within Blender, that would be really nice, but they don't seem to be concentrating too much on the texture painting at the moment, which is disappointing coming from my angle because I really like the texture painting aspects. But hopefully, well, they're always developing, and 2.81 with the sculpting is very exciting, and obviously other things as well. The faster render speeds are incredible as well, if you've got an RTX card, that is. So all those sort of things they're developing, so it won't be long, I'm sure, before they hopefully look at the painting within Blender. If you do want to know more about how to set up for texturing with layers, again, that's in the playlist, so do have a look at that. You can see at this stage I'm just going around and tidying up a bit, making sure all the details are in there, and at this point I've got all the base colours down and all the details, but I'm just going through and making sure that it's standing out, so highlighting areas, deepening the crevices and others, and make sure that depth is there and that contrast is there. Because it's so hard, this sort of modular way of approaching it, it's very difficult to get that depth. So going in, checking things out afterwards and making sure that it's working is quite important. You can see I'm adding some texture in here, so I'm adding the insides of my builder's hut. You can see in the concept art that there's this sort of light coming from inside, so I've made some walls in the inside because obviously they need to be two-sided, so I've made some extra walls on the inside and doing this sort of fake shadow from the doorway. So there we have it, the final piece. I'm happy with how it's turned out. What I do tend to do when I'm rendering is put in some 3-point lighting just so it looks nice. It won't look as nice as this in the game because I'll only be using one light, but when I'm rendering I like to use 3 lights to kind of show it off and show all the sort of detail that there is to the whole shape. Do remember to check out the other playlists, and if you've got any comments or thoughts then please put them below. Otherwise I will see you next time, and thanks for watching.